Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, as the case may be, and welcome to this time-lapse video looking at my Hogwarts modeling project. For this video, we're going to be working on sculpting this dragon that you see here that sits on top of the greenhouses at Hogwarts. So let's jump right in. You can see here that I've already laid out blueprints to help me organize my work. These are not completely accurate, but certainly good enough to get me started. You can also see I've got reference images up on the left in the background in Photoshop. And right now I'm starting to create the base mesh. So this is going to be the much more simplified object that then I'll be able to sculpt on top of to give all the cool details. So I created this as a curve and just giving different areas different thicknesses. Also splitting some sections off here since they kind of intersect with each other because of the way the dragon is kind of coiled up on itself. I want to make sure that I can turn these all into one single object that I can sculpt together as needed. That's looking pretty good. I should say that this is playing at 10 times actual speed, so this is very sped up. I definitely cannot work this fast. I'm not a very fast sculptor, nor am I an exceptional one, but hopefully this will bring some enjoyment for those of you who have been following this project. If you haven't, by the way, highly recommend you check out the blog, hogwarts4d.home.blog. Most excellent resource on all sorts of Hogwarts nerddom, if I may say so myself. Here I've got the head in the base mesh. Done it as a separate object. Let's see what I work on next. Moving the blueprints out of the way so I can see through them, but they won't get in the way. Creating the ears. I'm using slightly different techniques for a lot of these different objects. As I said, the body is just a curve that has a bevel applied to it, a thickness. I used box modeling for the head with a basic subdivision modifier. Same for the ears. And for the tail here, don't think I even bothered with any subdivision. Yeah, no, I did. Yeah, smoothed it out with a little bit of subdivision. Here I'm working on the arms, which protrude out and grip the side of the gutter of the greenhouse. Again, the blueprints are not 100% accurate to how they actually built it, and there's even some variation in how they built it when you compare the sets to the 1/8 scale models that were used for the greenhouses that the camera swoops in toward, and then the main 1/24 scale castle model, which of course the dragons are much smaller and so less detailed in that version. So I'm going for something of a happy medium between all of these different resources. I'm also not going to be particularly worried about it being super accurate, super precise, because realistically we're never going to be getting in very close to these things anyway. These are really just set dressing on top of the greenhouses, which are, of course, just one part of a much larger magical educational institution. Here I've created the fingers using the skin modifier, just using different tools as needed. Mirrored them over to the other side after running into some strange issues for a little while. You can see me kind of bouncing back and forth trying to figure it out. There we go. And at this point, I'm bringing in the main greenhouse model from my actual Hogwarts model, which is a completely separate file. I'm bringing in the greenhouse just purely for as a reference, so I can make sure that the dragon is going to sit nicely with the rest of the model when I bring it over to the main file. So there I'm adjusting a little bit of the thickness, adjusting the position, so he sits right on top of that beam pretty nicely. Or she, they, I don't know. Here I'm adjusting the angle of the claws, so that way they really grip the side of the gutter. That's a big part of the reason why I wanted to bring the greenhouse in. But then I hide it because I'm not actually working on the greenhouse itself. That's already made. But I can always make it visible again anytime that I need to make comparisons. Now I'm beginning the process of combining all of these different objects into one object so I can begin sculpting on it. I always keep copies of my work along the way, so I kept the base mesh objects and then duplicated them and used Boolean operations to bring them together eventually. Here I'm starting to play around with sculpting a little bit, although you'll see I end up completely redoing everything that you see here. Most of the sculpting that you'll see, I'm using a combination of the clay strips brush, smoothing with the shift hotkey, using the draw sharp brush some, more so for doing indentations than for having it poke out. And as I said, there's definitely some challenges with this because the design isn't quite the same from the technical drawings to the different versions that they built at the 3 different scales and for different films. So I'm just trying to get something that will look reasonably convincing. I'm using Blender's Dyntopo feature, which allows you to interactively add geometry, add detail, add resolution as you sculpt. So you can see that the areas that I'm sculpting have got a lot more smoothness, a lot more spatial sort of resolution to them than the other areas, which are still very basic. But as soon as I start sculpting on those, which you'll see me do in a moment here, there we go, it automatically adds a lot of detail. ZBrush, which is, of course, the industry standard for this sort of sculpting workflow, it has very similar features. Blender is, of course, my program of choice, partly for cost, partly just because I've been using it for so long and I enjoy supporting or participating in the open source community where I can. Here I've messed up the booleans, so the objects aren't joining together nicely. I think it was because there were just too many polygons. So I ended up going back and, as I said, getting rid of my initial head sculpt and starting over. That's okay. There we are. Now we're joining them up. I haven't quite gotten rid of the initial head sculpt yet, but it's coming soon if I remember correctly. I was noticing I have a lot of areas where the mesh is non-manifold, meaning it kind of goes inside itself in some funky ways that a real object couldn't. It's got parts that are detached, parts that are just funky. So I went ahead and redid some of that, joined them up, and now it's starting to work a little better. But I still ended up redoing some stuff anyway. A lot of trial and error. I spent a lot less time doing sculpting than more hard surface modeling. So I'm still very much learning. Incidentally, if you see anything in here that you're like, oh, why do you do it that way? Could have done it this way. It'd be so much easier. Then please let me know in the comments. I am very much still a work in progress, like all of us, and trying to keep learning. So very open to any critiques or suggestions. Here I've got the arms. I'm turning those into actual meshes in a moment. I've also separated out the forearms so I can get those intersections to work right. Become very important that I don't cheat the geometry once I go in and bake normal maps that allow me to fake the details on the final version of this. All right, so you can see I've gone back to the original base mesh of the head, abandoned my first attempt at sculpting it, but now I got them all merging together with Boolean operations correctly, and so I've got just one object, which I immediately have gone and duplicated, so now I can start doing the sculpt. Here we go. Similar techniques as the first time, hopefully a little better the second time because I've started it once before. At this point, you can see I've got the technical drawings, the 2 elevation views, hidden, turned off, because they're just going to get in the way for the most part. I really have used them to get the basic shape and dimensions and proportions, which is the main thing I needed them for, but a lot of the details do diverge in what they actually created for the films, and I'm relying more on what they created for the films than the blueprint. Then again, the blueprints are much more detailed than any shots I've ever found of those dragons, so it's helpful. The tail, I was really dissatisfied with for a long time. You'll see me revise it a few times, and I still don't really like the way it ended up. But again, I'm kind of going above and beyond with all this detail, since this is really just one small and relatively unimportant part of a much larger project. Sculpting the eyes again. I'm building the eye sockets, but I'm not going to add the eyes just yet. I could have added them, but I didn't. Messing around with some little droopy things on the chin, but nope, I sent them the wrong way, so reverse the direction. That's using the snake hook brush, which is really handy for things like that. Trying to add a little bit more definition to the nostrils, to the brows, to the cheeks. If this had been a more serious sculpting project that was going to be looked at up close, I probably would have gotten some anatomical reference from other illustrations of dragons and maybe some real critters like, crocodiles, T-Rex, Komodo dragons, because they have dragon in the term, in the word, in the name. Here I'm working on the underbelly. It looks, in the images I've got, like it's got sort of a snake-like belly like that, so I just went ahead and did it using the Draw Sharp brush, and then a little bit of scrape brush, a little bit of smoothing. Here I start to work on the tail again. Already not liking it. Just couldn't really decide exactly what I wanted to do with it. I can't see it well enough in the reference images, and it's kind of hard to tell what they were doing with the technical drawing too. Examining this thing from different angles. Tried to give it a little bit of a backbone. Later you'll see I come back and add some fins along the back the way they're supposed to be. Now I'm starting to mess around with texture. I'm thinking to myself, God, how am I going to do all of these scales? Because the most obvious way to go would be to create an actual texture brush and just kind of pattern it all along the surface. But for whatever reason, I was just kind of feeling like, oh, maybe I should try doing it manually too. So you'll see after I redo the tail, not for the last time, you'll see I go in and I start messing around with doing some scales manually. Spoiler alert, it doesn't work out. I mean, it works. It would have taken way too long. And again, there's kind of that cost-benefit analysis. Oh, here I'm adding the eyeballs. Cost-benefit analysis of, how worth it is the effort when I look at what the goals of this project and the scope of this project are, and the fact that I'm only one person. Adding a little more definition to the face. I really probably should have gone in and gotten some more anatomical reference, but that's all right. Working a little bit on those frills along the side of the head, which I knew were going to be an interesting challenge in terms of topology, but we'll see that in the next video. Shaping up the beak a little. I'm constantly using clay strips to add detail and smoothing with shift in order to get the chunky parts a little less chunky. One thing you may have noticed is in the blueprints, the technical drawings, it's got this curly, crazy tongue that sticks out of its mouth. That doesn't seem to be in the version they actually created for the films, so I decided to omit it as well. I gave it a little bit of a tongue-like shape inside its mouth. Again, we're not going to be getting very close. Same thing for the ears. I gave some indication of detail, but I wasn't particularly concerned about it having all the exact right details. Here's the tragus, here's the anti-tragus, Besides, it's a dragon. They can do whatever they want with their ears. using the pose brush to adjust the attitude of those ears a little bit. Trying to give a little bit more definition on the eyes. You can see I experimented a couple times here with the size of the eyes, as well as trying out sculpting in an actual pupil. I didn't end up liking the pupil, and so I left it without. I don't think there's one in the versions I sculpted, but it's hard to tell. Working on the hands a little bit, which have actually kind of a slightly human-like look, especially if you look at that main reference image I've got on the left, which is from the 1/8 scale model done for the greenhouse close-up visual effects shot in Chamber of Secrets. Adding a little bit of creases there, just playing around with different details. But yeah, the hands have a little bit of a human-like quality, which I find vaguely creepy. It's kind of cool. Starting to try to add claws, didn't like what I did first, so undo, try again. It's looking a little better. Again, there's so much more effort that would go into this if this were a standalone project that was intended to be viewed up close. This is not. Okay, trying the tail again. This is also not my final attempt. Let's see what happens next. Hope everyone's safe and happy and doing okay out there. It's crazy, crazy year. But yeah, hope you and your loved ones are doing okay. I'm doing okay. Helps having projects like this to work on. Other people to chat about them with. Oh, here you can see I'm working on the fins along the backside. I just I sculpted one, and then I duplicated it and resized and rotated. You'll see here in a sec. Gave it a little bit of detail and kept these as separate objects because I didn't want to have to deal with having them part of the same object. There we go. Just kind of eyeballing it. I admit I was not super pedantic about getting the exact right number and position of these compared to the actual model. It probably varied a bit between the different versions. In fact, actually, if you look at those smallest scale reference images, the ones that are taken with a flash, those barely even have any fins, so that's why I allow myself a little room for artistic license here. Okay, here I'm trying out some scale patterns, and the look is more or less what I'm going for. These don't need to be super detailed, anatomically correct scales. They just need to give the right impression from a distance. Try down at this end too. And so I was liking the results just fine, but it just was taking way too long. Again, this is playing at 10 times actual speed, so it takes a while. But by this point, I wasn't sure about that yet. I thought, maybe I'll give it a shot. So I work on it for a bit, turning symmetry on and off as I get to the midlines, so that way I don't end up with any weird, obvious symmetry. Then I had this idea, well, what if I jump into Photoshop and I try to create like a texture brush instead, and I just stamp that along the surface of the sculpt. And that's a more obvious way to go. Probably should have just gone that way from the start. So this is me creating the brush itself. There's a lot of things about this brush that I probably would have done differently in retrospect, but the end result ended up working out okay. White represents areas that are raised, black represents areas that are depressed, gray anywhere in between. And right now I'm just trying to create a large enough area to work with that I can figure out what I'm going to do with the sides. I hadn't decided yet if I was going to try to make it tile, which is what I tried to do here, and quickly discovered that it just wasn't going to be worth the effort, especially to do it manually. Looked kind of funky, as you can see there. So then I decided I was just going to fade the edges away to black and stamp it across the surface. I really probably should have done this with Blender's own fall-off options. Live and learn. Here I'm saving it as an image that then I can use in Blender as part of its brush. Messed around with settings for a while, trying to get the scale right. Trying to decide which way exactly I wanted to apply this to the surface. Ultimately, I decided to go with the anchored option in Blender parlance. So there I am masking out the underbelly so I don't accidentally bleed scales over into that area, which has a different look, a different texture. And so now when I go in with my textured brush, even if I go right up to the edge of the underbelly, it's not going to apply any scales to that area, which is very, very helpful. This is starting to look pretty good. Feeling like I'm on kind of a roll, but then you'll see in a bit here, I look back at my reference images and I realize, oh crap, I made the scales too small. So I went back and completely smoothed these all back out to nothing and redid them again. I'm not particularly proud of the way these different scale stamps work together. You'll see toward the end of this video, I go in and oh, there I am. I'm realizing my mistake. Yep, completely smooth out all those scales and start over. Much bigger, much better. And these are the actual scales that I ended up going with. But I was going to point out that a little bit later in this video, or much later I think, you'll see me go in and manually sculpt a few scales to smooth out the transitions between the different sections. I feel pretty good about the way it turned out in the end. Again, turning symmetry on and off as I get to the midlines so that I can make sure I don't end up with any awkwardness there. But symmetry is very, very helpful for working along the sides of this thing. Since I'm never going to see both sides at the same time, really, it's not going to be obvious that they're mirrored, especially from the distances we're normally going to be looking at this from. Adding more scales. Getting Scaly up in here. And here I pause to think about something for a moment. I don't know what. At this point, I'm not really paying attention to the way the fins interact with the scales. You'll see later I come back in and give a little bit more definition to that, a little bit more detail. That mask is still really helping me out with the underbelly. You'll see I modify the mask here in a bit. There we go. Masking out the areas that I've already applied scales to, so then I can just apply it to the areas that are still smooth as I get into some of these complicated, more intricate creases. The scales don't really seem to continue onto the hands, so I let them stop before we get there. Masking out the scaly areas again. That dark coloration won't show up at all in the final model, nor will this red color, which is just a matte cap that's there to help me see changes in the form, and hopefully model it decently. Here I'm masking out the fringes and the ears so that, again, I don't end up applying scales to them inappropriately. And here I get rid of my whole mask. Looking for spots that still need a little bit of help. Oh, and let's go back to the tail again. Tried that. Nope, that didn't look right either. Okay, take a little break from the tail. Sculpt in some of those little scales manually, like I said, to smooth some of the transitions between areas, so hopefully it's not too obvious. It's looking pretty good. Not too shabby. Here I'm adding the details around the fins. Largely invented. I can't really tell if that's there in the in the actual sculpts that they made for the film. But looks cool. Seems logical that it would be there. looks weird if it's not there, so I went ahead and just added it in. Working all the way up around to that dang tail. Let's see if I fix that yet. Nope. Gonna procrastinate and add some more detail and some more resolution to some of these areas. Viewing it with different types of shading. And here, I believe I duplicated it to try working on the tail again. I was like, let's see if I can figure something else out. So part of what I needed to do was slim down the edge of it right there. You can see I'm using a few different brushes to really pinch that down. And then here I just used the clay strips brush to add some texture that was a little different from what I'd tried before. It's still not great, but I decided it wasn't going to be worth it to try to push it any further. And that brought us to the complete sculpt. That's that same render that you saw from early on. The next step, because this is a very dense mesh with a lot of polygons, it'll slow the computer way down as part of a larger project. Next step is to vastly simplify that, to do some retopology, and then do what we call a normal map that we bake from the original detail of the sculpt to fake those details on that simplified version. And so we'll be doing that in part 2 of this video. See you soon.